Well, it has been a tough 2020. You had the COVID-19 pandemic coupled with a historic rise in gun violence. The past year marked the deadliest year for gun violence in at least 2 decades. That's according to the CDC. And then there's data from the Gun Violence Archive that shows there were nearly 20,000 homicides involving a gun or accidental fatal shooting, a 25% increase from 2019. And then gun purchases also on the rise, and that's according to Small Arms Analytics. An estimated 23 million firearms were purchased in 2020 alone. That's a 65% increase from 2019. Let's talk more about this. We turn to a new ABC News series, Rethinking Gun Violence, One Nation Under Fire, where we are examining the level of gun violence in the United States and what can be done about it. What can we all do about it? Joining us today, Dr. Daniel Webster, director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research, and also Paul Kemp, co-founder of the grassroots group Gun Owners for Responsible Ownership. Thank you both for being here with me, guys.
Good to be with you.
Dr. Webster, let's start with you. You know, you recently told ABC News that 2020 was, quote, the perfect storm where everything bad happened at the same time. So in what ways do you think COVID fueled the gun violence that we all experienced and the epidemic that we're talking about?
Sure. Well, we had an enormous economic disruption, of course. Many people were out of jobs. There was great uncertainty in the economy. Many of the systems that we rely upon, school systems, after-school programs, mental health services, all of those were constrained. Of course, policing was also affected by COVID, but they were also affected by some very high-profile events of police killings of civilians, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, just two that come to mind, and then the protests that followed. And, you know, the fundamental trust between police and community has always been an important determinant of levels of violence. And I think that there was so much lack of trust in so many different systems that none were working well, and it led to more violence. The last thing I'll say here in terms of this perfect storm, and this is something very particular to gun violence as opposed to other forms of violence, is it is a contagious process not too unlike COVID. One shooting leads to another and another retaliatory kinds of acts of violence. So there are a lot of things conspiring to really bump up violence very rapidly, and the systems we normally rely upon to constrain that were all overtaxed.
So, Paul, your grassroots organization, Gun Owners for Responsible Gun Ownership, pledges to, quote, reduce gun violence by leading the way in responsible gun ownership and firearms safety. What have you been doing specifically in the last year to work on that and secure gun ownership as being safer?
Well, in the last year, it's been difficult with the lockdown due to COVID and so on. We had a bunch of presentations scheduled with various pediatrician clinics to talk to the doctors and nurses in those clinics about safe storage of firearms at home, particularly when there's small children and teens at home, and just not to demonize firearms, just to show them how easy it is to do safe storage of firearms, and then give doctors and nurses some examples from another pediatrician on how to bring up the subject, which has been unfortunately made a taboo by the gun lobby as though it's something you cannot talk about, as we talk about, you know, are there adults home, you know, dogs, pools, and so on, with the safety of our own children and teens. Even though we haven't been able to do that, we have still been distributing gun locks. We've been doing online presentations and meetings with folks involved in the gun violence prevention arena. And fortunately, things are opening up. We've got some good projects coming up with some school districts, and get back with the medical community now that they can have some time to focus on other issues than COVID.
Absolutely. And Paul, you know, we mentioned that gun violence and gun purchases skyrocketed last year during the pandemic. It's hard to look at the numbers, you know, and not see a connection between owning a gun and this rise in gun violence. Yet you continue to support responsible ownership. So educate our viewers here on your stance.
Well, I mean, and a lot of people, if you've never bought a firearm, most firearms are sold with a locking device from the manufacturer, or the gun retailer will provide a locking device if there isn't one in the packaging, if it's a used firearm. So I think for a lot of people, it becomes a willful decision not to lock up a firearm. And, you know, we lost a relative due to a circumstance similar to that in 2012. And that's when I got active in it. And that's part of the reason we formed this Gun Owners for Responsible group here in Oregon. We had folks on the far left and on the far right, but really nobody in the middle advocating just for simple responsible gun ownership, which I think some folks in the gun lobby used to promote that, but they've kind of gone off the rails in the last few years, and I don't think that's their main mission anymore. And we'd like to get it back to that.
Sure. Another main mission would be, if you're going to own a gun, training, safety, safety, safety. How many times, you know, can we mention those two words over and over again? Know your weapon and know how to operate it safely. Dr. Webster, the CDC's latest data states that more than 58% of Americans are fully vaccinated, while 2/3 have received at least one dose. With vaccinations up and COVID cases well off the highs we saw earlier this year, do you think gun violence stats will actually begin to decrease as well? And if so, tell me why.
That's a great question. I do think that it will affect some of the factors that have been driving gun violence and perhaps help flatten that curve a bit. I do think, as I was saying before, though, that gun violence is something, and it sort of feeds on itself. Once it's on an upward trajectory, it takes a little time for it to start to ramp downward. But I've been studying gun violence for 30 years. I've seen these cycles. Being on the upslope is not a good place, but when we focus appropriately to address the problem, those downward slopes can be just as rapid. But my own intuition, my own sense is that our society and communities have been disrupted and changed in very dramatic ways, and it will take a little bit of time for us to address those issues to start to bring down the violence, at least at a rapid rate.
Well, we will stay on the conversation. Dr. Daniel Webster, Paul Kemp. Gentlemen, thank you for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.